Well, this one first, and these, this is what my work is about now. This kind of experience. There's no place to hide. Aire, agua, mundo, you see? Air, water, people. You see, mundo, everybody, everybody. Mundo means everybody. I've always had the extraordinary need to work. It's a need. It goes beyond, saying, no, I can't do that today. I'm too tired. I'm 97, honey.
So I discovered Luchita's work through working on a project for her late husband. And as I went through his work, I started discovering, several things that I knew that weren't his, but I didn't know were Luchita's. They weren't attributed to anyone, but there started to be so many that I realized they probably were Luchita's. Many of them were unsigned, or they were signed LH, and she now uses the name Mulliken, so I didn't realize that the Hurtado name existed. And I asked her about it, who is LH? And she told me, that was her, that it was not organized and dispersed throughout her husband's material. And we just kind of started bringing it all together, and now we have over 800 works. Luchita's work is this totally unknown female perspective and early mid-modernism. And the bodies of work are really compelling. I think not enough research has been done on what she's actually working through.
Luchita really knew so many of these different sort of international groups between New York, Mexico City, San Francisco, and LA that are canonized in American contemporary art history. She was friends with Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. Roberta Mata was a very important person to her. Rufino Tamayo, Jean Reynaud, Frida Kahlo. These are all people who Luchita had been friends with and who had sort of interfaced with on a personal level.
I see all kinds of things that may not be there for other people, but they're there for me.
I believe there were maybe some of the first in this series where she's looking down on her own body in a first-person view, and they seem to be taking place at night. A lot of her studio practice was after the kids went to bed and she had her own free time, and she said she'd stay up and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes. And this one I always thought was kind of more like sleepwalking or something, but then as I talked to her the other day about it, it's something about communicating with this plant and her connection with nature.
I put my hand on it and I talk to it. And it sounds a little crazy, but it works for me. So I've never minded being a little crazy.
So Luchita had talked about a ceremony where, I'm not sure which culture does it, but they put a feather above a flame and it will float if you put it in the right position. And she believed that she was that feather. And so that's where this image comes of the dual self-portrait with the crossed feathers above it.
I am a feather. I am related to a tree. I am related to water. All of these things, I think we are all related. It's all here in the world for us to enjoy, take, love. And I've always lived by that. I mean, I've done a lot of sexy things with my brushes, And I never kept from doing whatever came into my head or my feelings. And I think it's a need you have to comment on your life, whatever you're doing.
It's very interesting. She creates one body of work and kind of moves on to another, and that seems very ahead of its time. She's kind of always changing her media and the way that she's handling her materials, and so it's very interesting seeing the radical changes. This is a triptych by Luchita Hurtado. The first one is her self-portrait with the landscape behind, and then this one is just of the landscape. And this is a sacred mountain in Taos that she draws often. It's a forbidden mountain. It's a Native American land. And this one is the landscape with her silhouette integrated as kind of a shadow merging both the figurative and the landscape. But then there is kind of a weird existential kind of relationship between all of them, kind of becoming your surroundings. And this one is her smoking a cigarette and going to light, like an unbeknownst person to us, to the viewer, cigarette, and she won't say who that is, but it's possible it's like a spirit.
It's nature. I mean, you look at a tree in the rain, you look at a tree in the wind, a tree from my window. The way it moves, it dances, Trees are amazing creatures.
Luchita is very interested in nature. I almost feel that because she had such an interest in nature throughout her life, and it's such a gigantic source of inspiration for her at this moment with the things happening in the environment, it's almost like she's turned into an advocate. That passion has translated into her kind of needing to stand up for nature, as opposed to in her earlier work she would kind of just do nature studies, and now it's kind of warnings about the environment. It's transitioned.
Luchita's practice now is, I think, in a more overt way than ever, concerned with the environment and the ways in which we are relating to it, the ways in which we are abusing it. And I think this is something that you see throughout her entire output, always looking towards how us and our bodies are in relationship to nature, and thinking about how we are just extensions of that. But I think for Luchita now, it's especially important for her to sort of picture the friction between us as a species and our engagement with the environment and nature around us.
It's like that poster that says, there's no place to hide. I feel, like I'm running around saying, here, look here. We're having a problem here. Look at the poles, they're melting. You're not long for this world. Smell that. There's no air. I put down what I feel. There's no question. Yeah. For me, when I say there's no place to run or to hide, I feel it. I feel the earth is my space, you see. I belong on that little blue ball. I'm having a great life here. I don't know where I'm going when I die, but who knows? Or who's in charge. I've always been curious about who's in charge. I've changed my mind so often.
Whereas art is people, a city is only as good as its residents, and people are what make a story. Characters are what make feelings, and that is where art starts. People, emotion, story.
Every story that's ever existed is a story that can be told today. There are these great themes, right? So I think about, for instance, an adaptation of Electra that I did, right? And Electra is this 1,700-year-old story about a girl who, in her desire to avenge her father's death, destroys herself, her family, and her community. Well, you could say that about gang culture today, that our desire for revenge, we're still wrapped in the same cycle of violence, right? What have we learned about ourselves as human beings? Oedipus is a story about, it's prison metaphor, but California prison complex industry is huge, right? We invest way more in prisons than we do in educational systems. So what is that about, right? And usually every story that I start with has a kind of like a fact or a piece of information statistic that I've read that kind of leans me into the story. So for Oedipus, it's that 58% of all young men, 17 to 24, who get out of a state prison will go back at least once in their lifetime, recidivism rate. So that's interesting. The story for Medea for me was that more than half of all women who cross the southern border into the US undocumented are assaulted, most of the time raped. Wow, that's a huge number. So that's a huge sacrifice that someone makes to come to this country, right? So that's where the story is. What's underneath that fact? What's underneath that statistic? What is the story that you start to unpack underneath something like that? I'm fascinated by people who are stuck in systems. I'm fascinated by people who are stuck in like struggles of some sort, class, drugs, race, just people who are trapped, because that's where I think things really kind of start to express themselves. So, right, we all have feelings, right? We all have emotions that we express. And when a character is in a situation where they're being pushed up against a wall, they express themselves in a certain way. And so a lot of my plays have a lot of violence, for instance, or will have a lot of emotional response, because I think are people trying to figure out how to change the world that they're in. That was just something I think that probably came out of my youth and came out of my own struggles of being poor and living in a part of the city that was really hard to grow up in, and how do we survive systems, right? Is the system poverty? Is a system, class? What is it? And how do you survive it, right? I think that's where my stories tend to come from. So I tend to do a lot of research. I tend to meet a lot of people. I tend to really want to not create them simply out of my head, but meet real people with real stories that I can then base my stories on. So I'm looking for authenticity. I'm looking for something much more organic. I want the real language. I want to hear somebody talk the way they normally talk. So early on, I had 3 guys show up. One of them was very involved in city politics, and 2 were just homeless guys who took offense to the use of the word homeless and would prefer for me to use the word roofless or outdoor resident. So there was ways of sort of empowering themselves to think about how they exist in the city, what role they play in it. And that rarely happens.
All right, so let's transition into this piece which we're calling at the moment Mother of the Row. Sometimes as a writer, things kind of inspire you, and the thing that inspired me about this was how might I transfer the idea of a piece about war into a piece about poverty and homelessness, right? And how we might just explore those themes with the same sort of urgency.
So how am I tying Brecht and Mother Courage, right, into a very LA story about homelessness? So the original is really about war, but I think a kind of central conceit can be that homelessness is a kind of war we're involved in. It's a kind of environment that we've created. All of us have created it because we've allowed it to happen, right? So Mother Courage for me represents a woman who not only lives on Skid Row, but uses it to her advantage. She sees a body on the street, and she's assuming it's expired, it's a dead person who didn't survive Skid Row, and she strips that body of all of its worldly belongings. She's gonna take those shoes and she's gonna sell them. What a terrible person, right? Or is she selling them because it's the only way she's going to eat? So selling those shoes is an act of survival.
A body, fresh, just expired, lying on the street over there. What do you care? You don't care. A body, a meal.
And I love characters that are complicated like that, because I think that everybody has a little bit of good and a little bit of bad in them, right? So when I go see a play where you meet somebody who's really virtuous and very nice and sexy and wonderful and smart and good, they kind of bore me after a while unless they have a little touch of something inside them, right? Because we all have a little touch of something inside of us, right? That make us a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. And I think it's that complication of character, the complexity of character that allows us to see ourselves, the mirror of ourselves in society. What are the lines in the sand that you're willing to cross? And my job is to create empathy. I want you to like Mother Courage, right? I want you to, we call it Mother of the Row. I want you to really like her.
I am the mother of the row, la madre de la calle. I live in a house with no roof. My yard is 1 mile round. Living on the streets, I am the new explorer, the one who makes do.
So Santa Monica for me feels like a microcosm of a bigger city. It has all the elements of a gigantic city, and it's a gigantic city, but it has all the elements of it in just a smaller way. I think it's a little more condensed and compressed in that way, and that you see homelessness is a huge issue here, and you see how it plays off. In terms of the numbers of the homeless, it's just a smaller number, but it's still the same problem, right? So the microcosm of it is interesting because it's a city of possibility. It has the high and the low in the same city. That's interesting to me, how populations can live together in one place and exist, and what does it mean when that happens? So every morning I get up with the desire, quench, thirst for saying something about the world, staying interested in the world. Junot Diaz says, that art is about the world, right? So you also have to go live. You can't just write, you have to live in it to write about it. And I really believe that. I think that, one of the joys of making work, especially when you're young, is doing as much of it as you can, because all of it leads to something. All of it leads to a muscle. So I'm always trying to find a better word to say something, right? And I think it's the process of doing that for so long that you get better at doing the work, right? You get more articulate at the work. And then never losing interest in the world. So artists are about inquiry, right? We have a strong sense of something we want to say about something. And I think that's the thing that keeps you going. Who am I writing these stories for? Why am I telling these stories? So ultimately, that very personal thing lives inside of you, and then you want to share it with the world, and then you find a tribe that wants to hear it, right? And then you find your audience, right? But I don't think it's healthy to have everybody love you. I don't think that's good. I think it's important to have people who don't like you either, because that's one way of keeping yourself in check in terms of the work you're doing too. We have this saying called Inglakech, a famous Mayan saying, "Tú eres mi otro yo." You are my other me. I'm really just writing us. I'm writing our story. That's the other part of who I am as an artist. I work in the we and the us rather than the I and the me. I can write our story too. I can write a very human story about what it means to be here today.
The great thing about Kelly's work is that it's a physical manifestation of energy. It's power, it's strength, it's dynamic.
A lot of my work really has to do with this energy of the earth. And, when I visit these places like the volcano, it's just amazing to see that in person.
You think about work throughout history that has attempted to do the same thing, and you think of someone like Frederick Church, the American painter of the 19th century who painted massive icebergs, and he also painted volcanoes. But there's something more visceral about Kelly's work than anything I've ever seen before when it comes to tackling energy. I mean, there's a physicality, a real off-the-wall physicality.
And I think a lot about, painters who have worked with the idea of the sublime, this experience that one has that's both terrifying, beautiful, overwhelming. And I think that's such an important part of our landscape and our world.
There's just an electricity about her work that is like nothing else I've ever seen. And on top of that, she has just this great dexterity and facility with materials that allows that energy to become manifest in a real dynamic way.
This painting behind me is called Inner Earth, and I've done a few paintings with a pyramid inside of a cave. The idea of the cave is this dark, mysterious place underneath the earth, and I like thinking about kind of the mystery of finding something like human within that. And I also think it's interesting how the forms relate. The pyramid is almost kind of a symbolic image of a stalactite, and that's something I think about a lot too, is volcanoes in a sense are pyramid shaped, and so I'm kind of using that simplified image as kind of a symbol of this inner power of the earth. In this particular piece, I kind of almost see it as this like perseverance of this form kind of emerging from the darkness. With the pyramids, I think about ancient cultures and how they form these symbols to represent power and also kind of the journey of the afterlife. Extreme weather has always fascinated me and also kind of been a part of my own personal experience. It was like, tornado warnings and, seeing these huge clouds approaching, lightning. Even my family, on our way back from Yellowstone National Park one time, we had a really close encounter with a tornado. I was 12, and we were all in our motorhome, actually, and just on the highway, and a tornado went probably about only 100 feet in front of us. So we couldn't see it. It was just a wall of rain. When the rain cleared, it was like this clear path. After that experience, I actually, instead of I was really terrified of the storms, but that's when my interest in them really took off. It's just crazy to see that power of nature so up close. It's kind of exciting to be really, in that dynamic weather. Something that I'm really interested in is kind of illusionistic space with really kind of a three-dimensional rendering of a landscape or a phenomena versus real three-dimensional space. And I like to really play with the idea of multiple layers of reality within a piece. Geological forms taking shape over thousands of years versus this one moment of the lightning. So the viewer is not only kind of taking in this 3D aspect of the work, but then also into the illusion of the 3D. I like the idea that the viewer could kind of enter the space of the cave, kind of through this sculptural, and almost seeming that it's like, a dynamic landscape. It's almost like moving, but you're not quite sure. It's kind of mysterious. I was inspired actually when I went to the Big Island of Hawaii and to the Kilauea volcano. And what's interesting about how the lava dries, the fresher areas have this almost like oil slick appearance. And so you do get this kind of rainbow iridescence. And that was really fascinating to me. And I was really focused on how could I recreate that. This image, which I wanted to kind of keep mysterious, and kind of be this more imagined landscape, really kind of emerged this idea of not really having a traditional reference point for the horizon line. So kind of taking away that traditional aspect of landscape painting and kind of creating this more chaotic, kind of almost like ever-shifting world within the piece. I'm really happy to be showing in Santa Monica, and specifically at Bergamont Station.
A lot of the work that I exhibit has reference to the poet Gary Snyder's quote, "Our place is part of what we are." And I believe that, and the work that I show often has a relationship to place. It's not about specific, landscape, obvious pictures of the Santa Monica Pier. That's not what it's about. It's more about how a place influences a person and how that person reflects where they're from. And Kelly does that. For one thing, the paintings in this room are about earthquakes. And Kelly's from Minnesota. They didn't have earthquakes in Minnesota. They had tornadoes.
I want to capture that chaos and the energy of these, plates shifting in the earth. And I'm trying to capture that through paint and how I use the materials in addition to the image.